Hi everybody, I'm Angela Clark with Threadwaggle Quilting, and today we are going to be working on Quilt Path. So I have my system set up behind me for my Quilt Path, and I'm going to be showing you how to do a pantograph quilt. So to do this, I'm going to need to move cameras real quick and get them set up, but it'll just take me a second. Now you can see my Quilt Path and you can see my quilt that I'm going to be quilting. In case you're wondering why the frame looks so short, it's a 5-foot frame. So it is just set up for me to be able to film content on. And I can quilt really small quilts on it, like this is a panel that I'm going to be quilting today. But it really doesn't matter how long your frame is, right? It's making sure that the quilt you are quilting will fit into the frame you have, which is happening perfectly fine right now. Okay, other differences you're gonna see, I'm using a different mount than you would typically use on a Quilt Path. I wanted to have a pole that I could rig cameras on, so I set that up for me. I used some of the original hardware for my Quilt Path, like the actual bar that comes up to the back, and then mounted my tablet differently so that I could mount cameras later. And you're also going to see, there's going to be some things that may be in frame that typically you're not going to see. There's actually a GoPro running on the bottom down here so that I can get close-up pictures and get hopefully better pictures for the filming. So if you see something come into frame at the bottom, that's all it is. There's another camera running down here. There's actually 3 cameras running right now. And then I'm recording my screen as well so that we can try to get you close-up shots so that you can really see what I'm doing inside the program. And this is why. When I put my finger up here, it covers the screen, right? So I want to make sure that you guys can actually see what I'm clicking on inside my program. So now that we've talked about like the housekeeping for what's going to be going on in this series, I'm going to be running with all these cameras the whole time I'm doing this series. We actually have multiple microphones going too to try to make sure that we get the best video that we possibly can for you, okay? Okay, so at this point, we've already loaded our quilt, and there's videos on that. Look at the previous videos for this video series. You're gonna see how to load your backing, you're gonna see how to do the little test strip on the side of it so that you can test your tension and make sure it's perfect. We've done all of that. This video is gonna be just on how to set up Power Panto to quilt your first quilt. So I am gonna go ahead and choose my pantograph, and then it's gonna ask me to set my safe area. So I'm gonna go out 3 inches past the side of my quilt, and then as far back as it'll let me, and hit my top left, and I'm gonna come 3 inches the other way, and hope I clear my camera. And go as far forward as it will let me, and 3 inches off the surface of the quilt, and hit bottom right. And what that does is give me a really big area for Quilt Path to work in. And I'm gonna step in front of the camera real quick so I can get my batting in my top back over the top of my screen. Okay. Okay, awesome. So right now I'm in basic mode. I want to start out by teaching you Power Panto. So I'm going to come down to this mode button at the bottom, and I'm going to switch to Power Panto mode. And the reason that I'm doing that is Power Panto is by far the easiest mode to use. And you can do about 95% of all designs you want to do on your quilts with Power Panto. It locks your aspect ratio. It's going to take a lot of the guesswork out of how to set the quilt up. So it's going to be quick, easy, and efficient. And those are the 3 things that make me happy as a quilter. So in Power Panto, I need to tell it how long my quilt is. So I know that my quilt height on this quilt is about 46 inches. Okay, so I measured it before I put it on the frame, type in 46 inches. Now, a little bit later in this video series, I'm gonna actually show you that it's not really that big of a deal how long your quilt is. As long as you have at least 1 row on your pantograph that is not the top or the bottom, so it's not cut off, we can help you get it quilted even if you make a mistake and you don't put the quilt height in there. So don't stress out too much about that, because more than likely the first couple quilts you do are going to have several rows in them. The next thing I need to do is the quilt width. Now, Quilt Path is going to measure slightly different than a measuring tape is. So I am going to measure this quilt top out by the edge of my, the edge of the top, right? So I'm going to measure it, but I'm going to measure it with the computer and not with a ruler. And the reason I'm going to do that is if the measurement is off, I'm going to let Quilt Path's measurement be correct in this case. So I am going to pull my whole Quilt Path over and look at where the top right corner of my top would be, and I'm going to put the side of my hopping foot up against the raw edge of the quilt. So I'm putting the right side of my hopping foot up against the left side of my quilt, and the left side of my hopping foot up against the right side of my quilt. And what that will do is make my needle float ever so slightly in the batting, right? It gives you a little bit of oops room, and in this case I'm going to be chopping off quite a bit of this quilt, because right here we actually cut into this panel, so I'm only going to be using a little bit of this blue as an outer border. I'm not going to be using the entire amount of blue that's out there. So I could be setting this inside and it would be fine. In this case I'm going to be chopping off quite a bit of the quilting, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. I can chop that off later. So my next thing to do is to go into the ruler at the top of Quilt Path. So with that needle, the right side of it up against the left side of the quilt, I'm going to tap the left button on the bottom, and that's going to say where the left side of this quilt is going to be. Then I'm going to scroll across. I'm just doing it kind of slowly, because sometimes you catch things as you're going across and you want to know that you're going to have an issue there. Now I have the right or the left side of my needle against the right side of my quilt, and I'm once again just going to tap the right button. And what that does is give me this big long line on the surface of my quilt. So you can see the big long line, and it's telling me that it's 35.359 inches. Now, I'm going to leave that number. I'm not going to round up or down on the width. I'm going to let Quilt Path be correct in this case. And the way that I do that is I need to make sure that it's only giving me the width measurement. Your width measurement is gotten by touching the button that is right below the toolbox. Okay, so I'm going to tap the one below the toolbox, and nothing's going to change because I was measuring width. And then the next thing I'm going to do is tap my apply measurement button, and that's going to apply that weird 35.359 measurement to the width of my quilt. So that's the number I'm going to be using to calculate how wide my quilt is, and then also, you know, how many repeats of my design I'm going to need for this particular quilt. The next step is going to be to select my pattern. So I'm going to select my pattern, and in this case I'm just going to use Curl EQ real quick, because I just want swirls all over this quilt. And what I'm looking for is this big part in the center. I think I want that big part in the center to be under 1.5 inches. So I am going to zoom in so that I can see the big part in the center, so I can see it clearly, and I'm going to hit the X over here on the left, and that's going to keep me zoomed in. Then I want to see a grid on here because I want to see what this measurement is. So I'm going to go to my Options button, and I'm going to tap on Show Grid in the Pano Stacker area. And I'm going to say, okay. That is going to put a 1-inch grid on the back of my Pano Stacker. Now I can see when I do that, that this is not 1 inch. I can also see that somehow stagger got turned on, which we'll talk about in just a minute. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off because I didn't mean to touch it yet. But I can see that I have a 2.5 inch roughly space, and I told you I wanted it about 1.5 inches. I want to quilt this kind of tight. So I am going to reduce my pattern height until I like the size of that space. So the way that the swirl works, I have 1, 2, 3, and then the 2, that big section in the center is like 2. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little areas in 6.5 inches. So I'm going to start by changing it to 5, because that would give me about 1 inch each. Okay, and that is going to change that to about a 2-inch center. So then if I do 4.5, right, it's getting smaller. So I might have to look up at a one above it. It's about 1 7/8 inches. So let's look at it at 4 inches. You see where I'm going with this to get it the size I want it to be? So, and I'm looking at one specific part of the design. And that is typically how I will set up my designs. Now, I am going to tell you that I think that may be a little bit tight, because it's putting the outside areas at about 3/4 of an inch. I think I actually want my outside to be closer to 1 inch, which would put this back up at about 5, guys, right? Okay, so now if we're looking at, well, this is about 1/2 to 1/2. You can see they're running in about the same area on, 2 separate lines of the grid, which is what I'm looking at. So that actually makes me happy. And I will tell you, I regularly will quilt this design out at about 5 inches, anything more than that. And for my quilting and the way that I like my quilting look, it's a little bit too open for what I do. So I have customers that do like their quilting to be a little bit more open and not as dense. So at that point, I can choose to make this bigger to make my customer happy, right? So what I'm gonna do now is I want to stagger this. So I'm gonna go back to my Zoom, because I want it to be full screen, and I'm gonna tap the word fit. And it's going to bring my entire screen back up so I can see the whole quilt. And the next thing I want to do is, it's really hard to see what's going on with this grid. So I don't always want my grid on. I turn it on and off as I need it. So I'm going to turn it off now, because I know what the size relationship is on this design. Okay, and now I'm ready to look at the design and see if I like it. Well, it is touching, first of all, and second of all, it looks like little soldier swirls marching down the street. And I would rather have every other row offset. So I'm going to do that by tapping stagger. Okay, and I do like that a little bit better. So let's see what happens if I flip this, because this is, at this point, I am designing this to get it the way I want it to look, right? So I'm going to try to flip my design this way. So it's really hard to see on the screen. These teeny weeny little lines actually have arrows on the end of them. So the top 4 are flipping right and left, and the bottom 2 buttons are flipping up and down. And at any point you don't like the way it looks, you do flip X and it clears all the flips. Okay, so I'm gonna start out by flipping everything. Okay, so it's really the same look, just reversed, right? So if I flip every other line, we could do that. To me, that's a little bit busy. So I'm just gonna clear that, because I'm not gonna do that one. Let's see what happens if I flip all of the odd designs. Well, that makes kind of an interesting design. It's a little bit different. It doesn't look like the original swirl. So we could do something like that. The next one is going to look very much the same. It's just gonna put the diagonals. So you have diagonals of lines that are trying to line up. And the reason is that this one is assuming that you are not staggering your design, okay? But that looks fine too. What happens if I clear all of that and I just flip every other row? That's fine too, right? So all of those would work. Now I'm going to tell you that I actually like it best with no flips in this case for what I'm doing, because it's just an all over, charity quilt that we're quilting real quick. And I don't really need all of the activity going on and the craziness. There's enough in the back of this panel with the cartoons that are going on the panel, okay? So at this point, I have this set up the way I want it to be set up. The next thing I need to do is tap sew in zones. So I'm gonna look at the bottom and make sure I have a green light, which I do, and then it says it's continuous. Those 2 things are gonna tell me that my design is gonna stitch all the way from the left side to the right side. I also want to make sure that I didn't actually tap on sew through clip. Sew through clip is checked by default, and I do want that to be sewn. I do want that checked. I'm going to explain what that actually does when we get over to where we are starting to sew our design, which is going to be next week. Okay, but sew and clip I do want checked, and then I am ready to hit sew in zones. It's going to take a minute for it to bring up the save screen. Okay, but it's going to ask if you want to save your zones, and you do. As long as you save now, we can get you back up in quilting. This is saving your zone, so it's saving the file as it is set up, and then how it's cutting it at this moment. You can change how it's cutting it later, so don't let that stress you out too much, but it's saving the output file for Quilt Path to quilt. So we're going to hit yes, I want to save it, and then you're going to give it a name. So I am going to name this video, because that's what I'm doing right now, and hit enter, and then I'm going to hit save. Okay, and that is all there is to setting up your pantograph. The next video we do is going to go through how to sew out your pantograph. So if you have not already subscribed to our videos, you're going to want to do that. So tap subscribe on your screen. You're also going to want to tap the bell notification so that you get notified when the next video posts. Once again, my name is Angela Clark. I am with Threadwaggle Quilting, and we are going through how to quilt your first pantograph.